Thank you, everybody, for coming. I appreciate it. It's been a real journey. Thank you to my committee for all the help. Don't worry, I am not forgetting individual thank yous. I'm just going to do them at an appropriate time in my presentation because it will coincide with certain things that I want to talk about. So, I want to start real quick with a little bit of background just because I think it's important to the journey in which got me to this show and then the materials and processes that I used for these works. And I'm going to touch on what I'm referring to as synchronicities when it comes to how this applies to art history, processes, and my research in esotericism, mainly narrowing that down to alchemy and the way that works for me. So to begin with, just as real quick, as fast as I can, talking about what brought me here, a break from a previous professional experience where I was a chef. I made more money than I've ever made. I had more control than I've ever had. I controlled all the staff. I wrote all the menu. No one could tell me what to do. And I was miserable and drunk most of the time. And that became a life lesson where I became aware of what changes need to happen in my life and what actually means something and what doesn't. And that's how I came back to school in the first place. Here, I had a pretty isolated undergraduate study experience because I was on house arrest most of the time. The reason I bring this up is because it creates a sense in a person where you have to find a way to transform in order to survive. You have to be able to recognize where your shortcomings are and where are shortcomings being projected onto you by other people and how that applies to your process and what you decide you should or should not participate in. Now that has an effect on your psyche when it comes to authority, and it puts you in a place of a slight institutionalization where you start doing things to please authorities instead of yourself or what you may or may not be doing in that personal transformation in the first place. I wanted to touch on the pandemic because I had, for anyone who's not aware, 2 years of floating around while other graduate students were finishing their projects, finishing their MFAs, seeing what they were doing, watching their talks, seeing their work in the classes in that process. And then I started my first year during that pandemic, and I think this is directly applicable to how I am now after the second and third year, because it has a direct reflect on our spaces, our working processes, the classes themselves, who is present and who is not, and this future that we're all heading towards when it comes to dealing with what that has as an effect on productivity for the art world, and what that means for the future of how this gallery setting is going to look. And I think that that's applicable. And that brings me all to like what I will call my narcissistic version of this, since I get to talk about myself here at the beginning, which is what I call the SDVR survival transformation. This is in hindsight as I'm putting this together, bringing things, seeing those synchronicities in hindsight and my work, and looking for those academic and art examples to make that come out. This is the survival transformation of coming from a life of sex, drugs, violence, and rock and roll. This comes from a lifestyle of being a chef into alcohol and drug use, and then trying to break yourself out of that so that it doesn't kill you. This brings me to touching on a little bit of spaces and creative environments. This is also why I want to touch on the pandemic a little bit, because that had a profound effect on the way we could function here and not make each other sick, but still be productive and being able to interact with one another. And that had a lingering effect when it comes to teaching, still working in these spaces, what spaces we can use, what spaces we can't. I have here the three main spaces. My office studio and the graduate studio became more of a place where I was taking stuff during critique or got done. And the three more main spaces that the larger work and the majority of my time was spent was in my garage, which is this first picture, in my small office at home, which is the second picture, mainly because I'm using electronic components and 3D printers, stuff I need to keep clean and static free. And then the cage and sculpture, where I would do active class work, bring in larger pieces that can't go anywhere else, and really be in that space, mainly while I was teaching sculpture, and then just during class while I'm not. So I just wanted to touch on a few of those things real quick as fast as I can so we can come to a place talking about my research in esotericism and alchemy and how that applies to the place I was in getting into that research and why I called this show The Vulgar Eye. So there are a few references in esotericism and Dante's vernacular rhetoric. However, what rung the most true to me was beginning research on alchemy and a particular paper written by a man named John Dee called the Monus Hieroglyphica, discussing the hieroglyphic monad, which is a geometric symbol he used to describe a philosophical argument for why man could make things through artifice better than nature. This is a long time ago. It's pretty fundamental at this point when it comes to the world of philosophy. However, at the very end of this book, there was an added page. There's also a copy in the desk if while you're in here looking, you want to take a look at it. At the very end of the book, there was an added page that in Latin said, "Here the vulgar eye will see nothing but obscurity and will despair considerably." And for me, that stuck with me from the moment I read that and became a part of these coincidences or synchronicities that I'm seeing throughout my research in alchemy and the cycles of reemergence that happen in it. So when I say my research has been in esotericism, to be more specific about my work, I would call what I have decided to call physics mining and magic or esotericism mining to make work to either cope with or comment on contemporary issues or issues in my life, friends, and family. Now, when you talk about esotericism, this can go in a million different directions real quick, and it does when you're researching it. There's religion, there's magic, there's cults, there's occultism. And I wanted to focus mainly on alchemy as a place to bring it into a narrowed down space, and specifically for this show to put it in the context with my material processes, because this became in my research a dual transformation. It's about originally the transformation of vulgar metals into precious metals, and then as it cycles through reemergence throughout popular culture, scientific culture, and art history, it becomes about personal transformation depending on who's using it and who's redefining it. As I mentioned, many cycles of reemergence of alchemical imagery and processes altogether. The original processes, as I mentioned, with the vulgar metals into precision metals or precious metals, has 4 stages, and each time it's been redefined or reused to suit someone's purposes. It's been changed a little bit. The processes have been added. In this show, I've shown you the steps and processes that equate a 7-stage process that has more to do with Jungian analytical psychology and personal spiritual transformation, of which there are many contemporary still running religions that focus on this as a foundation for how they get their point across. There's also a re-emergence many times when in contemporary popular culture we talk about changing in a way that discusses the binary. This has been used, again, many different ways, but what this comes down to is the idea that you're merging dualities within yourself into one balanced thing. Or you're merging the allegory of a male character and a female character to a more enlightened character. Many of them, for me, it became about that personal transformation and material transformation and bringing 2 things together that may be in conflict and try to find some balance and harmony in it. There's the psychological reemergence, mostly by Carl Jung, that becomes either a method of self-improvement or the therapy itself. And then there's the endless sea of how alchemy is used in popular culture, whether that be movies, video games, on pretty much anything. And it speaks to this universal need for a human connection to the spiritual. And when we get into a world that's dominated by science and atheism, we tend to look to these other places for that spiritual connection. So I'm only going to touch on a couple to get us where we need to go, talking about how this connects to contemporary artists and how I see that synchronicity in my work, starting with Carl Jung and his book, Alchemical Studies. He looked at alchemy as all symbols and allegory, and not in a scientific way, that he could then use that as a mechanism to apply psychological science to study what he saw as the difference between unconscious mind and conscious mind. And therefore, as a therapy, you could use these allegories of alchemy to process what he would call the rest of the whole, which is your personality. He did not really try to split off with this activity, but it was a split off from his predecessor, which would be Sigmund Freud. And this was kind of his way of making it more modern and discussing one thing that he called, which is the first stage of all alchemy, Negredo, in the past, in the original, which I have put as calcination in the show, which is when you burn all of it to the ground in the first place so that you can come back out with those materials to transform them into something else. The next thing I wanted to touch on was the emergence of Theosophy, because this is a direct influence on many, many, many artists and almost 100 different religions that still exist. I'm not going to really get into the thick of Theosophy, but it's kind of where a lot of the art and literature merging with this science and religion comes together. And I'm going to be discussing that a little bit when it comes to later movements that come from this. So I want to touch on this. Pretty much comes from, again, religion, cults, magic, Gnosticism, and Neoplatonism. It's accredited to being founded in New York City by Helena Blavatsky. There's many other people, but this is the accreditation. The big thing here is a spiritual movement that included Kandinsky, Kupa, Mondrian, Malevich, in this world of bringing spiritualism into those design elements that you would use in your paintings or work. An idea, in Theosophy, they would also consider them as initiates put here to bring us wisdom as the viewer through those visual aids, or through those visual techniques. A glimpse into the mysteries of the cosmos. As I mentioned, I am now going to go into what I've considered the synchronicities in my work. I've put just here a little definition of what that means. It's a term that Carl Jung used to discuss basically coincidences that seem to not be meaningfully related or connected, but seem to have evidence of a connection between mind and material objects. Now for me, this became one of the most important things trying to traverse graduate school. And mainly this is understanding the philosophies that you're working with, understanding the history. How does that apply to what you are doing and actually apply, not just become a part of the performance that we're all participating in and applying. It actually has to have meaning. Some of you have heard me say this, for anything to mean anything, you have to actually want to sit at the table. It's not enough to just act like you want to sit at the table, at least for me. So the first thing I want to talk about is a work called The Representative Humanity, which is a piece by Rudolf Steiner and Edith Marion. Rudolf Steiner was a member of Theosophy, and then later, as he developed ideas of how this should apply in his contemporary world, this would have been 1917 and 1925, a more educational form and social psychology way of talking about that spiritualism and Theosophy. He called this I say this wrong every time, anthroposophy. It's like anthropology and Theosophy put together, right? So this was a sculpture he created for the first temple, which is they called the Goetheum, which was burnt down, and they built another one, and this was one of the main piece in that, which becomes a depiction of Christ as a human representative man in the battle between Lucifer and Aramaic influences. For them, this was a commentary on the idea of spiritual growth in religion and the conflicting ideas that you would get from Christianity, especially when it comes to the practical application of meditation, spiritualism, and technology in your lifestyle, in the way you actually live your life. Which brings me to one of his students, Joseph Beuys. This is kind of like a continuation of that educational aspect with Beuys. He was a fan, somewhat of a student of Rudolf Steiner's, except his intention was always to use both instructive and therapeutic forms in his work in a more, what he called social sculpture way. I don't want to get too deep in each individual art history. I want to apply it to the alchemy, but the idea is to use shamanistic and psychoanalytic techniques to manipulate symbols to affect your audience. He had said that after a really dark depression in his life, he felt that he had been initiated into shamanism and art, and he considered a part of his responsibility through teaching and his artwork to get these ideas of social structure across. And that speaks to this piece, The Silence of Marcel Duchamp. Is overrated, and it was kind of a commentary on Duchamp giving up on explaining things, giving up on trying to make that connection with the viewers and teaching them something, a part of that aspect. Which is also, to me, was interesting because he was also a fan of the Dada to a certain degree, right? Directly inspired by them with the Fluxus. So this would have been 64 that he did this as a broadcast from Germany. One, this speaks to what we're about to talk about when it comes to Duchamp and the esotericism in his work, but more so it talks to something to me, the synchronicity becomes Beuys' ideas of social sculpture, which I don't entirely agree with, the idea that everyone is an artist. I do, except when it comes to the practical application of course, everything we do all day, every day as a part of our lives. And I don't think you can just do that. I think you have to have that commitment to that and put that work into that, and it's actually your life. And the reason I wanted to put this in there is because it is your life. It's not a performance. It's not a job, although some of us have that job. At least for me, it is my life and keeps me alive, and therefore is no way impersonal. It's all personal. There is never a situation where you can say to me, oh, don't take that personally. Now, when it comes to Beuys' application of this in social sculpture, he would be way more of a better educator and nurturer when it comes to my views of this. However, it's still something important to talk about because it is one of those responsibilities that we all have to decide if we have it or not and in what form we have it. How much of that applies. Now, to me, it would be my friends and family, the people who have put that time in and invested in me and my well-being, and I'm sure that this is different for everybody. And I wanted to put this commentary specifically on Duchamp because I will be moving to Duchamp. And I love this quote because of the way I was seeing it and the way I researched it. And it says, if I have ever practiced alchemy, it was in the only way it can be done now, that is to say, without knowing it. So his application of alchemy is a lot harder to explain. It requires getting into his patrons. It requires getting into the avant-garde in New York at the time, and specifically many connections that have more to do with what Jung would call that unconscious mind, the things he's directly selling to people. Specifically, the Ehrenbergs and Catherine Dreyer, who also worked with him to start the Societe Anonyme, which was kind of like a New York movement to bring modernism to America. Both of which, Dreyer was a big fan of Rudolf Steiner, both of which were big fans of Theosophy. And there's a lot of conversations of this going on at the time. So like the connections with alchemy here really begin there and go into admittingly debatable realms because it's him and we got to take him at his word or not saying a word depending on how that plays out given piece. The example I will use would be the bride stripped bare by her bachelors even, or better known as the large class. So again, grain of salt when it comes to that connection. You need to know about those patrons. You need to know about that money changing hands. But one could argue, one read of this piece is that it's the unobtained desire fueling the machinery that activates the imagery he created of both the male and female. Now, as I've mentioned already, one of the many allegories and the many processes of that self-transformation is that duality and bringing it together to create a new balance. He said he completely forgot about the idea of the futurist movement. In this, he constantly tried to recall something that had not happened before, and he was interested in introducing the precise and exact aspect of science, which hadn't often been done. And this wasn't for the love of science that I did this. On the contrary, it was in order to discredit it. He also sold it to the Ahrensbergs. So my argument would be, whether it be intentionally because he knows they want that content in Theosophy, or subconsciously, unconsciously, that I would argue that this has to do with bringing that duality, or more accurately for him, the unfulfilled ability to bring that duality together because it cannot be fulfilled, and the anxiety that comes along with that. So what he's doing here, in my opinion, is he's using what he would often do, also in my opinion, which is use a modernist visual vocabulary to describe what I would call neo-alchemy. Bringing those things together, it becomes about what he wants it to be. Me as a third-party observer, I see those allegories, I see those connections. That's the synchronicity for me. So I would call it neo-alchemistic allegorical content. Here it's that unfulfillment of merging that binary for a balance to bring your self-transformation. These are the biggest three synchronicities that I saw in art history, or artists and their ideals. But there are a couple that come from technology or new media in that respect. So one would be Egyptian shamanism. And in this context, in the pieces that I have in the gallery, the idea of audio frequency healing. You also see this sometimes with chakra healing, frequency, electromagnetism. For me, it started in electromagnetism, and that becomes that relationship, how you can manipulate that to make audible tones, and then those audible tones can be used in resonance to heal certain transformative problems with your body or physical illnesses with your body. This was a cult-like idea in early Egyptian shamanism, and the reason I say this is because the last living Egyptian shaman died about 20 years ago, and he would say this, but no one in revising history will say this. He is on record saying it, which is why I'm comfortable doing that. But it all absorbs into that mystery, which is the history, the architecture, the meaning behind the pyramids, and what's been done to them since we found them. This is also a AI-generated image through the prompts that I've been working with. I've got thousands. This just happens to be one that's not included here. That is its interpretation of my writing on a audio frequency healing transmutation circle. This transmutation circle is also what is down here on the floor. A different version that I recreated specifically this space that has the material components of the other work in the space to connect it to that audio healing sound rather than just the idea of that healing in the circle itself. The last technological connection I wanted to talk about is what I've been referring to as the Great Archive and the Singularity. This is where my work has come into this combination of observation, especially at Purdue University as a research and scientific university, which is the statistical truth that we call truth now. The danger, it's the first thing you learn in statistics class, correlation is not causation. Except, again, as we get deeper and deeper into less spiritual research and more scientific method, that truth becomes 51%. What that means is, as long as we've established through a study that it's at least 51% going to happen this way and we can predict it, that becomes the truth over anything else. This is great for predicting systems, for predicting what you want to happen, great for making plans for success, awful at describing anyone's soul or you as an individual. And it's the individual that breaks those statistics, and I would raise as the questionable problem with making that truth. And again, this is all me and my path in synchronicities. I'm not saying anything's right, I'm not saying anything's wrong, but I think it's important to know as we discuss this particular connection in this talk. So what I call the Great Archive would be basically the accumulation of all human knowledge at this point, since without it all erasing, it will always be there, and that fundamentally changes the way we function, whether that be, I remember when I graduated undergrad, I got a card that said, have fun looking up all the things I can Google. That kind of mentality. But really the danger here is losing yourself in it. Judging yourself, judging others, mainly how smart you think you or they are based on these statistics that do not allow for what you've learned through your 30 years of experience. The singularity is just the title I've given this AI deity that would be bringing this propaganda to the world. This is the imagery on this made altar piece that I called Make Your Offer As Above, So Below in the front of the gallery. This is an AI-generated image that comes from a lot of work generating concepts of AI, singularity, or machine learning deities, apostles, and priests. All of this, to me, to speak in that connecting these systems ways to bring up that idea of the Great Archive, and whenever this influence becomes so great that it becomes the next religion in science. So that's pretty much the explanation of this process. You are more than welcome to ask questions. I kind of tried to get through that journey and the connections in alchemy and spiritualism as it comes to my path and journey. So if you have any specific questions about how that applies to the examples I made, or how that applies to the material processes in the show, feel free to ask.
I have a question. So as somebody who also has a certain amount of interest in esotericism, occultism, stuff like that, I know a lot of it can be very hard to research. Sources are vague or just kind of missing. So how did you go about kind of finding all of the information that you needed? Do you think it maybe wouldn't have taken you as long if you had chose a different subject, or do you think?
I think the reality of that is that it will never be over.
Yeah.
You know, like this is why I brought up, like, it goes into religion, it goes into magic, it goes into the occult, it goes into cults. Because a lot of the research advice I got at the very beginning was from religious scholars.
Okay.
Because a lot of it comes from really early religious readings. And they would suggest, you know, the Summa Perfectionis for the first thing that you... Now, this became so difficult to get a hold of, not in Latin, that I had to borrow an interlibrary loan from Pisa.
Oh, wow.
Right? And that's pretty much true for everything. The way you can buy your way out of making it faster is learn Hebrew, learn Latin, and learn Aramaic. And then you'll have like all the resources you want on archive.com or archive.org, and you can just read them. And one would argue you get a pure interpretation without a translation of a translation. But the simulacrum is important to note on that too. That's why I call it the cycles of reemergence, because it is all a copy of a copy of a copy of a copy. It's all out of somebody's mouth to another, to another, to another. It's a telephone game. And every time, and this is not a conspiracy, it's not like an opinion, they redefine it every time. You know, Jung's understanding of alchemy and its origins was bad. It's not accurate at all.
Yeah.
Right? But he got to do that. He got to redo that.
Yeah.
You know, and this is why I brought up the popular culture references too, because obviously nobody cares if they do it, so they do it all the time. You know, how many people know the character Nicholas Flamel in Harry Potter?
Yeah.
Nicholas Flamel is a fictional alchemist character that has existed apparently for 1,500 years, that they adopted from that mythology and put in the movies to connect to that.
Yeah.
There's also a guy named Saint Germain, which is apparently a guy who used to show up to a lot of courts over the history, over a long time of not being able to, couldn't possibly still be alive.
Yeah.
But he would keep showing up at court and claiming that status. Sorry, I started ranting about it. As you can see, I've been thinking about it for quite some time.
When you talked about the esoteric, the people who started esotericism, the artists, and you mentioned Kandinsky, I wonder if do you know who Hilma af Klint is?
Yeah.
Okay, because your work looks like that. You didn't mention her because she's now people are beginning to think that she is the original spiritual painter and the founder of abstract art.
That's super interesting because like my experience with her and my introduction to her was the science. It was the electromagnetism. It was that, and that was clear to me looking at it. But again, yeah, I mean, especially for me, you can see it for sure.
Put it in your
Okay.
Women.
2 new books just came out.
Oh, did they? Oh, she just said 2 new books came out.
That was one of my influences during Charles's last class.
Right.
Any other questions?
Yeah, I also, can you explain these?
Oh, the separation. Yeah. This is found material. What this is filters out of an entomology lab that I caught them getting rid of. And it became this super interesting, beautiful thing to me that spoke directly to that separation process in alchemy. So after you get through knowing where you need to be, then calcifying it all down to ash, you then want to separate the good parts from the bad parts. If you're going to transform yourself, you don't want to keep any bad parts in. Now, for the record, this is something Jung would call your shadow, and he would disagree. He would say the point is to know your shadow so well to use it. However, in alchemy, it has to do with that process of separating the good parts from the bad parts. And this, it was one of those synchronicities. I was there in my life. I was there, I saw it, and I had to grab it. And ever since then, I've been staring at them for months. And I finally decided to let them stand on their own, seal them so none of the biological material could infect anybody, and let them stand as these monoliths for themselves.
I'm trying to formulate my question. I don't know if I'm going to be able to. But I'm thinking about sort of a difference between the literal and the experiential and the symbolic. And I'm wondering, I feel as I walk into, say, this space here, you're using material in sort of a symbolic way. Like, it's inspired by your research, but some of this also feels quite literally like you're attempting to perform experiments, you're attempting to actually get the viewer or the experiencer to have something pulled in out of their brain or inserted into their brain through the wavelengths coming into the space or something. So I'm wondering if you could talk just a little bit about what we're supposed to, how the viewer interacts with the work when there's symbols we may not understand versus when we get to interact with the work when there is maybe an aesthetic and a material that might make us feel a certain way.
Absolutely. I'm glad you asked that because it's, for me, one of the biggest challenges as working with both esotericism and technology. It becomes how much instruction do you need to give? How much, of those symbols need to be defined? So I appreciate that. So what I would say is that for the processes going over here, you're right. There's more of a ritualistic symbolism that goes into the layers that become these scrying. I equate it in my mind to the Hopewell culture or pre-Adena people where they would build mounds throughout the northern continent. And each one of those layers has a very symbolic meaning that has to be there. And for me, the experience there for the viewer really is like time spent seeing those layers, especially in the scrying mirrors. There's a year's worth of layers in there. And I feel like for me, it's about coming into it, being initiated into the process. And then the more time you spend, the more you're going to understand, the more you're going to know. With the prints and the AI work, I feel like that experience is more, the prints on this wall with the desk in that space become like a primer of a vocabulary. It's all sigil magic that has protection in it. But it's more like combining that with that stone lithography process, which became the ritual in itself, and then trying to bring that back to a vocabulary with the symbols in that space. So it's kind of like again, the vulgar eye concept with that Latin in the first page. Obscurity or despair, and the only way you can uplift that obscurity is to spend that time to want to understand. And there's no logic argument against you don't care, so you have to want to care, and then there it becomes, you know what I mean? And again, not good or bad, but that's, in my opinion, that's the way it works. So I feel like the longer you would spend in this specific work, the more it would start to make sense with each other.
Can you talk a little bit more about the use of text and labels in the gallery? Like, I noticed that there's a lot of information over here that's didactic about kind of ways of seeing or divining truth, that sort of thing. There's a whole list of them on this wall and how that relates maybe to the work in the gallery or how text is used in other pieces.
Absolutely. I mean, this speaks to the previous question as well. It became what I thought I was comfortable with when it comes to over-explaining to the audience versus explaining something that would make this specific event or experience more meaningful. The reason I went with the mini Mancies is it's really just a long way of explaining that throughout all of our cultures and histories. There's pretty much almost anything that you conveniently ascribe to what you know and your processes and your materials to divining the future or having a knowledge that's exclusive. You know, one thing about esotericism is that the second definition of it is that it's exclusivity of knowledge, and only the initiated can know. And I understand that, but I also agree with Boyce and that idea of going through that darkness to be initiated as someone who can help other people see it. So with the text in here, I actually redefined all of my labels as helping to make that more clear in this specific show. Most of the labels that I came up with these pieces as I'm doing them have like an esoteric museum sort of workspace label to it. So it's scrying NC-1001, scrying NC-002, and less metaphoric or allegorical labels. But here, I wanted to go through those 7 steps in that process and bring it back around to that deity who would control it. So that made it a little bit more understandable and left room for whatever interpretation you wanted to do. For example, this piece as this like imagery based off of the scientific notion. A lot of hubbub we're hearing about with the James Webb telescope right now, and that was the inspiration for this. But in my mind, instead of what it does, which is look into the past to see what's going on in the universe, this is kind of my alchemical version and divination in general. So if I'm looking into this piece of technology, what can I tell about the future? Point being, no label there aside from the alchemical stage for that reason. How much of that technology do you get? How much of that alchemical process do you get being through here? And that became, at that point, it became about a flow through those processes, through the actual physical materials of the work as you move around the room. And that made the most sense to do from the scrying, that space. This is why I put all the Mancy's there. This is kind of like that experimental, finding that knowledge, spending that time to learn, to even know what's going on space with the desk. Hence the long list there. And then at that point, it became about how those stages are specific to the physical materials in the work around the space.
Can you talk a little more about what's in the black, in the individual black pieces?
Yeah, sure. This was
Stuff submerged in each one. And
This was like a process in itself over time. The first one and most reflective, being kind of its own standalone scrying piece. The origin of this comes from people who would scry into obsidian cut mirrors to divine the future. I should also say that most of this is done under the influence of a spiritual substance. Just so to be fair. Both. I mean, it depends. Again, it reemerges and it depends on who you ask. I also really loved how that worked out in terms of you seeing yourself in this and you seeing everything and everyone else in the gallery in this. But in that one particular, and I bring this up first because it's the longest running one, that took 1.5 years. And for 1.5 years, that sat in my workshop space. It collected dust. It collected thousands of spiders, thousands of June bugs. There were spider webs on it. Anytime I'd cut another project or frame another project, it would all get covered in sawdust. And then, this is because I layered the very bottom with driveway tar. And then one day I came in and I thought a mouse had got into it because at my house I'm fighting the Great Mouse War for the 5th year. And I realized it was a bird. And it somehow a bird had gotten into the garage and then gotten down on that. I assumed to try to eat some of the bugs out of it. And it had managed to stick its head in and it got stuck and its last breath got stuck in the tar. And at that point, up until then, I thought maybe this is a ruined thing. It's sat here too long, this process. I mean, I think it's interesting, but is it going to work out? And then the moment that happened, I considered that a synchronicity that, we got to finish this. And that's when I actually started the process for learning how to get the epoxy to set on top of the tar in the first place. And then you start learning about how that process works, how much time the tar has to sit, the temperature that the epoxy has to be, because it has to be a little bit warmer. I also tried coating the surface different times, because if the very top of the petroleum still has a certain amount of oil on it, it won't set. So that's what I intentionally did much quicker with the one that's on this far wall, because when it separates, it creates this matrix that I find super interesting, and it speaks to like this relationship of the, you know, as above, so below, as that metaphor for the microcosm and the macrocosm. It also lends itself to that maintaining that aesthetic of the black scrying mirror. And then it didn't set all the way, so when I lifted it up, it started pouring out, and that became this living painting that has a life of its own in that space, and I really love the way that worked as far as that transformation, even if it's a limited amount of time. And then these two, the diptych is the most recent, and that's when I started actually bringing in non-natural intentional materials instead of just letting it do, mainly from those esoteric sources. So on the right-hand side, it's a mesh of copper to speak to, again, that Hopewell pre-Adena people and the importance that copper had in that culture. Very, very many shaman origin stories have a connection to copper saving their life, and that's why they were able to go on and live and be a shaman to help the tribe. And then that calcination, or in the mounds, it was a layer of a particular tree ash, burning everything down to create that layer in the foundation. So there I spent a few nights making fires and burning specific pieces of wood that I knew I was about to take that structure and put back into the top. It's also why I left that one uncovered with epoxy and then covered this one epoxy, because I also wanted that matrix over the top of the copper structure, and I didn't want it over that burnt foundational piece. Any other questions? So I just want to touch on one thing while everybody's still here. I brought up, my transition from undergrad, because I really think I have many conversations about this, and it's one of those things that people claim to understand, and then basically they say something that's empirical evidence that they don't. So I want to say this just because it's really important that you guys know this. So I'm pretty confident, I'm 99% sure that if I didn't have Fabian and Sigrid during my undergrad, I would be dead right now. I want to let that sink in so you really hear me. Because again, it's one of those things, yeah, I relate to the dark times, I relate to those bad things. This place in general, and I don't mean Purdue, I mean, the services and mental health services that we have in Lafayette, is a black hole, mainly because two bastards embezzled most of the money from Wabash over the course of the past 10 years. But I want to make sure that the two of you understand how much I appreciate that. And it's 100% true. Thank you.
I'm doing so clean up.